They say a man can measure his life by what he keeps or by what he gives away. And on that cold morning, Elias Boone was about to learn the difference the hard way. The first sound came low, almost mistaken for thunder rolling across the plains, but there were no clouds in the sky, only a pale stretch of blue and the thin whistle of wind slipping through the cracks of his weathered barn. And then the ground itself seemed to answer, a steady rhythm. Hoofs, more than one, more than 10, enough to make the loose boards along his fence tremble just slightly, just enough to tell a man he wasn't imagining things. Elias stepped out onto the porch, boots scraping against dry wood, his hand resting on the post like it might steady what was coming. And out beyond the stretch of open land, past the brittle grass and the low rise of dust, he saw them, silhouettes first, dark shapes cutting through the morning light, riders, a long line of them, moving as one, quiet, controlled, deliberate. He didn't count at first. Men like him didn't waste time counting when they already knew the number didn't matter. What mattered was what they wanted, and no one rode in like that without wanting something. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing against the sun as the figures drew closer, the details sharpening, horses with strong necks and steady steps, riders sitting tall, faces unreadable at a distance, but carrying a presence that felt heavier than the heat already starting to rise from the dirt. Elias felt it then, not fear exactly, something slower, heavier, the kind of understanding that settles in a man's bones before his mind catches up, the kind that says this moment was set in motion long before it arrived. His gaze flicked once, instinctively, toward the empty rail beside the barn where his horse should have been, where it had stood every morning for the past 5 years, waiting without question, a quiet companion in a land that offered little else. And now there was nothing there but a length of worn rope swaying gently in the breeze. He exhaled slowly, the memory rising whether he wanted it or not, the image of a dusty trail, a figure collapsed near the edge of it, and his own hand loosening its grip on the reins, letting go of the last thing that tied him to survival out here. The riders were closer now, close enough that he could hear the soft jingle of tack, the leather creaking, the low breaths of the horses as they slowed in perfect unison, not a single one breaking formation, not a single voice raised, just silence stretching between them like a line drawn in the dirt. They stopped just beyond his fence, 200 strong if a man had to guess, though the number hardly mattered anymore. And for a long moment, no one moved. Elias stood there, alone, unarmed in any way that counted, his shadow long behind him, the morning sun climbing higher as if it had no interest in what was about to unfold. And then one rider shifted forward, just slightly, guiding a horse ahead of the others, a familiar shape, a familiar step. And something in Elias's chest tightened before his mind could catch up, because he knew that horse, knew the way it carried its head, the small mark along its flank, the quiet strength in its stance. The rider stopped at the edge of the gate, and when she lifted her head, meeting his eyes across that narrow stretch of dust and distance, Elias Boone understood that whatever he had given away yesterday had not disappeared into the horizon. It had come back, and it had brought something with it that he wasn't ready to name. The rider did not rush, did not raise her voice, did not offer any sign that matched what Elias had expected from 200 mounted strangers standing at the edge of his land. And that was what unsettled him most, because out here silence always meant something heavier than noise. She guided the chestnut horse forward one careful step at a time until it stood just outside the broken gate. The same gate Elias had meant to fix 3 seasons ago, but never did, and now it leaned slightly, like it too was unsure whether to hold or give way. Elias kept his eyes on the horse at first, not on her, taking in the small details that confirmed what his instincts already knew. The worn leather saddle he had stitched himself, the faint crease along the reins where his hands had rested day after day, and the way the animal shifted its weight, recognizing the place even before its owner spoke a word. The horse let out a low breath, almost a greeting, and that sound landed deeper than anything else, because it carried memory, routine, something steady in a world that had not offered much of it lately. Only then did Elias lift his gaze to the rider, to the woman who now sat straight-backed in the saddle, her posture calm, composed. Nothing like the figure he had found the day before. There had been dust in her hair then, exhaustion in her shoulders, and a quiet urgency in her eyes that did not need translation. and now those same eyes held something else, something measured, something that made it clear she had not come back alone by accident. She studied him for a long moment, not with suspicion, not with gratitude, but with a kind of recognition that felt earned rather than given. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried across the space between them, steady and clear. "You stood where no one else would." And the words settled into the morning air without demand or explanation. Elias shifted his weight slightly, the boards beneath his boots creaking, his hand dropping from the post, as if he had just remembered he was still holding on to it. And he glanced past her then, past the horse, to the line of riders stretching behind, all still, all watching, not a single one breaking formation, not a single movement wasted. And it occurred to him that this was not a group that followed noise or impulse. This was something organized, something bound by more than chance. He had seen men gather before, in towns, around disputes, around trade, around trouble, but never like this, never with this kind of quiet agreement that needed no words to hold it together. His eyes returned to her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The space filled instead with the soft sounds of wind brushing against dry grass and the faint shift of leather and reins. Elias finally let out a slow breath, his voice rough but steady as he said, "I did not ask who you were." And she gave the slightest nod, as if that had been part of the measure all along, as if that choice had carried more weight than he had understood at the time. She dismounted then, one smooth motion, boots touching the ground without a sound that matched the number of riders behind her, and she stepped forward, closing the distance to the gate but not crossing it, stopping just short as if acknowledging a line that belonged to him. Her hand rested lightly on the horse's neck, fingers brushing the familiar coat, and for a brief moment Elias saw it again. That flicker of the woman from yesterday, the one who had needed help but had not asked for it twice. "A horse is not just a horse," she said quietly, her gaze lifting back to his. "Out here, it is a man's time, his distance, his breath." And Elias felt the truth of that settle deeper than any explanation could have, because he had lived it, every mile, every sunrise, every long stretch of land where the only sound had been hooves and wind. He gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because there was nothing else to offer that would not sound smaller than it should. Behind her, one of the riders shifted slightly, just enough to remind him they were still there, still waiting, still part of whatever this moment was becoming. And Elias realized then that this was not the end of something he had done. It was the beginning of something he did not yet understand. And whatever it was not going to pass quietly like most things did out here. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the dry scent of dust and leather across the space between them, and Elias could feel it settle into his clothes the same way the moment itself had settled into his chest, heavy and unmoving, as if time had slowed just enough to make every detail matter more than it should. His eyes moved again to the long line of riders behind her, noticing now what he had not allowed himself to see before, the way each horse stood calm, the way each rider held still without tension, like they were not waiting for an order, but honoring something already decided. And that realization made him straighten just a little, not out of pride, but out of understanding that this was not a threat in the way he had first believed. Still, 200 men did not arrive anywhere without purpose, and purpose out here always came with weight. He glanced back toward his barn, toward the open door where the emptiness still echoed from the night before, the missing presence of the animal that had carried him through miles of heat and cold, through years where survival was less about strength and more about endurance. And he remembered the quiet that had followed after he let it go, the kind of quiet that does not comfort, the kind that makes a man count what he has left and come up short. He had sat on that same porch through the night, watching shadows stretch and disappear, listening to the wind as if it might bring an answer it never did. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, he had accepted what he already knew, that he had given away more than a horse. He had given away his last advantage in a land that did not forgive hesitation. Now that same decision stood in front of him, returned in a form he could not yet measure. The woman followed his gaze for a brief moment, as if she could see the memory passing through him. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer, not weaker, but closer to something that carried weight without needing to prove it. "Last night was not easy for you." and Elias let out a small breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it, just recognition. Out here, nothing is, he replied, his tone even, his eyes returning to hers. And for a second, something shifted between them, something that did not belong to either side but sat in the space they shared, built from choice rather than circumstance. She nodded once, a small movement, but one that seemed to ripple back through the riders behind her, not physically, not visibly, but in a way Elias could feel more than see, like the air itself had adjusted to match it. Then she reached for the reins and extended them toward him, not crossing the gate, not stepping onto his land, just offering. And the gesture was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried more meaning than anything else that had happened since the riders appeared. Elias looked at the reins, then at the horse, then back at her, and for the first time since they arrived, hesitation found its way into his stance, because taking the horse back would mean something he did not yet understand, something that might bind him to whatever this moment was becoming. His fingers flexed slightly at his side, the memory of holding those same reins still fresh, still familiar, and he realized then that this was not just about returning what was given, this was about what came with it. You rode hard, he said quietly, not as a question, not as an accusation, just a statement that acknowledged the distance between yesterday and now. And she gave the smallest hint of a smile, not soft, not warm, but real in a way that did not need to be explained. Not alone, she answered. And with that, Elias understood that whatever had begun on that dusty trail had grown beyond a single act, beyond a single choice. And the 200 riders behind her were not the end of that story. They were only the beginning of something that had been set in motion the moment he chose to give instead of keep, and standing there, with the reins still hanging between them, he knew that the next thing he did would matter just as much as the first. For a long moment Elias did not move, the reins hanging there between them like a question no man could answer too quickly, the leather swaying just slightly in the breeze, as if even it understood that this was not a simple exchange. His eyes dropped to his hands, rough and worn from years of holding on to things that did not always stay, and he felt the weight of that choice again, the one he had made without thinking far enough ahead, the one that had cost him a night of cold silence and the kind of doubt that does not speak but sits heavy in the chest. He lifted his gaze slowly, meeting hers again, searching not for answers but for something steady, something he could stand on without losing himself. And what he found there was not gratitude, not expectation, but something closer to respect, the kind that does not ask, but recognizes. His hand finally moved, slow and deliberate, reaching out, but stopping just short of the reins, not out of fear, but out of understanding that once he took them, whatever this moment meant would no longer belong to yesterday. Out here, he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach her without touching the riders behind. A man does not take back what he gives. And the words settled between them, not sharp, not defensive, just true in the way only lived things can be. The horse shifted slightly, ears flicking toward him, recognizing the voice even if the distance had changed, and that small movement pressed against something inside him that had not yet let go. The woman studied him for a second longer, her fingers still resting on the reins, her posture unchanged, and then she nodded once, slow, certain, as if she had expected nothing less, as if this too had been part of whatever measure had begun the day before. She lowered the reins slightly, not pulling them back, not insisting, just letting them rest in that space where choice remained his and his alone. And then she stepped back half a pace, giving the moment room to breathe. Behind her, the riders remained still, but Elias could feel the shift again, subtle, like the air adjusting around a decision that had just been made. He let his hand fall back to his side, the tension easing not because the situation had changed, but because something inside him had settled into place, something that did not need more than what had already been done. Then why bring him back? Elias asked after a beat, not accusing, not confused, just seeking the shape of what stood in front of him, and her eyes softened just slightly, not in weakness, but in clarity. She turned her head a fraction, glancing toward the line of riders behind her, and for the first time since they arrived, one of them moved forward, guiding another horse into view, then another, and another, until Elias realized what he had not seen before. that the line behind her did not hold just riders. It held something more, something that had been hidden in the distance, something that now stepped forward one piece at a time. Horses, strong, well-kept, each one led with care, each one brought forward without noise, without display, until the space beyond his fence no longer looked like a gathering of men, but something closer to an offering. Elias felt his breath slow as he took it in, not counting, not measuring, just understanding that whatever he had given had not returned in the same shape. The woman turned back to him, her voice steady, carrying the weight of something that had been decided long before this morning. "You did not give to gain," she said, "so we do not return to repay." And she paused just long enough for the meaning to settle. "We return to honor." The word lingered in the air, quiet, firm, and Elias Boone, standing there with empty hands and a full horizon, realized that what stood before him was not a trade, not a debt, not something that could be counted or owned, but something far heavier, something that would not leave when the riders did, something that had already changed the ground beneath his feet without asking his permission. And for the first time since they arrived, he understood that this moment was not about what he had lost, but about what had found him in return. The word lingered longer than it should have, not loud, not forced, just present in a way that made the air feel different, and Elias stood there without moving, letting it settle into him the same way dust settles after a long ride, slow and quiet until it becomes part of everything. His eyes drifted past her again, but this time not with suspicion, not with caution, but with something closer to understanding. Taking in the line of horses now standing just beyond his fence, each one held steady, each one waiting without restlessness, as if they knew they were not here by accident. He stepped forward then, one measured step off the porch, boots pressing into the dry earth that had seen more seasons of struggle than comfort, and he stopped just short of the gate, the distance between them now small enough that he could see the fine details he had missed before, the stitching on the saddles, the careful braiding of reins, the quiet discipline in the way every rider held still without needing to be told. This was not chaos, not coincidence. This was intention shaped into form. The chestnut horse shifted again, leaning slightly toward him, and Elias felt that pull in his chest once more. Familiar, grounding, the kind of connection a man does not speak about because it is too simple to explain and too important to ignore. His hand lifted again, slower this time, not reaching for ownership, not claiming anything, just acknowledging what stood in front of him, and his fingers brushed lightly against the horse's neck, the warmth there steady, real, unchanged by distance or time. The animal let out a soft breath, and that was enough to remind him that some things return not because they are taken, but because they choose to find their way back. He let his hand fall again, stepping back half a pace as if to keep the balance of the moment intact, and his gaze returned to the woman, who watched him without interruption, without expectation, her presence as steady as the riders behind her. "You bring more than a man can use," Elias said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of truth rather than refusal, and she inclined her head slightly, as if the answer had already been considered long before he spoke. "A man does not measure what he deserves," she replied, her tone even. "He measures what he stands for." And the words settled deeper than any offer could have, because they did not ask him to take, they asked him to understand. Elias exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just enough to show that something inside him had shifted, not broken, not changed entirely, but moved into a place where it could see beyond survival alone. He looked once more at the line of horses, at the quiet strength they represented, and he knew then that this was not about replacing what he had lost. It was about recognizing what had been given without demand. Behind her, one rider dismounted, then another, until several of them stood beside their horses, not crossing the fence, not stepping onto his land, but remaining where they were, as if honoring a boundary that did not need to be spoken. One of them stepped forward just enough to place a small bundle near the gate, wrapped in worn cloth, then stepped back without a word, and Elias noticed it only after the man had already returned to his place, the gesture quiet, almost easy to miss, but impossible to ignore once seen. Elias glanced down at it briefly, then back up, his expression unreadable but no longer guarded. And for the first time since the riders arrived, He allowed a small nod to pass between them, not as agreement, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement that whatever stood between them now did not need to be forced into words. The wind moved again, lighter this time, carrying with it something that felt less like tension and more like space, and Elias Boone realized that this moment was not asking him to decide what to take or what to refuse. It was asking him to stand still long enough to see that what had come to him was not meant to be owned, but to be understood, and in that understanding, something quiet and steady had already begun to change the way the world would meet him from this day forward. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the land like a second sky, and Elias stood there with the faint weight of understanding pressing against his chest, not heavy enough to crush him, but enough to remind him that something had shifted in a way that would not easily return to what it had been before. His eyes moved again to the bundle resting near the gate, small, unassuming, almost out of place among the quiet strength of horses and riders, and for a moment he left it there, untouched, as if waiting might reveal something more than action would. The woman noticed the glance. Of course she did. Nothing about her suggested she missed small things, and yet she said nothing, did not gesture, did not explain, simply allowed the moment to remain his. Elias stepped forward again, this time crossing the short distance to the gate, his boots pressing into the dirt with a soft crunch that sounded louder than it should have in the stillness. And he crouched slightly, reaching down toward the bundle with a hand that had learned to move carefully around things that carried meaning. The cloth was worn, sun-faded, tied with a simple knot that did not resist when he loosened it. And inside he found something that made him pause, not out of surprise, but out of recognition. A small set of tools, well cared for, wrapped with intention, the kind a man uses to mend leather, to fix what breaks instead of throwing it away, and beneath them, folded neatly, a strip of soft hide, clean, untouched, waiting to be shaped. Elias ran his thumb along the edge of one of the tools, feeling the balance of it, the weight that spoke of use rather than decoration, and he understood then that this was not a gift meant to impress. It was something meant to endure. He looked up slowly, meeting her eyes again, and this time there was something different in his expression, something quieter, something that did not question but acknowledged. "You saw the fence," he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful, and she gave the smallest nod, her gaze drifting briefly to the leaning posts, the loose boards, the signs of time that had not been kept in check. "We saw a man who fixes what he can," she replied, and the words carried no judgment, only observation, the kind that does not demand more than what is already there. Elias let out a breath that felt steadier than the ones before, his hand closing gently around the tools before he set them back into the cloth, tying it again with care, not hurried, not uncertain, just deliberate. When he stood, he did not step back immediately. Instead, he rested one hand lightly on the top of the gate, fingers tracing the rough wood as if measuring something only he could see. Behind her, the riders remained in place. But there was a shift now, subtle, almost like the beginning of movement held just beneath the surface, and Elias could feel it without turning, the way a man feels a storm long before the clouds gather. He lifted his gaze once more to the horizon beyond them, then back to her, and for a moment neither spoke, the quiet between them no longer tense, no longer waiting for something to happen, but settled into something that already had. "You could have taken the horse," Elias said after a pause, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, something that belonged to yesterday more than today, and she tilted her head slightly, considering the words before answering. "We do not take what is given freely," she said, her tone steady. "We carry it until it finds its place," and Elias felt that settled deeper than anything else she had said, because it turned his understanding just enough to see the moment differently. The horse beside her shifted again, stepping closer to the gate, close enough now that Elias could feel its breath against his sleeve, warm, steady, alive, and he did not move away this time, did not step back, simply stood there as the distance between what was his and what had been given blurred into something that no longer needed to be separated. The wind moved once more across the open land, lighter now, carrying with it the faint sound of leather and breath and something else that felt like quiet agreement. And Elias Boone realized that whatever had arrived that morning was not leaving the same way it came. and neither was he. The moment did not end. It unfolded, slow and deliberate, like something that had been waiting long before Elias ever stepped onto that porch. And as he stood there with the warmth of the horse's breath still brushing against his sleeve, he noticed the smallest change ripple through the line of riders, not movement, not sound, but intention shifting into form, one by one, without command, without signal that he could see. The riders behind her began to guide their horses forward, not rushing, not pressing, just stepping into view with the same quiet discipline that had brought them there in the first place. And Elias felt his chest tighten slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of what he was beginning to understand. This was not a return, not in the way he had known returns. This was something built, something layered, something that carried meaning in each step forward. The first rider stopped beside the chestnut horse, then another beside him, and another after that, forming a line just beyond the gate. Each animal strong, steady, chosen with care rather than convenience. And Elias realized then that these were not extra, not spare, not something taken lightly from abundance. These were deliberate, each one placed there like a word in a sentence that did not need to be spoken aloud. He remained still, his hand resting lightly against the rough wood of the gate, feeling the grain beneath his fingers as if grounding himself in something familiar while everything else shifted into something new. The woman watched him, not guiding the riders, not directing them, because she did not need to. Whatever this was had already been decided before they arrived, and her role was not to lead it, but to stand within it. "You think this is too much," she said quietly, not as a question, but as something she had already seen in him. And Elias let out a slow breath, his eyes moving across the line of horses now standing in front of him, each one representing more than he could use, more than he could care for alone, more than he had ever expected to hold again. "Out here," he said, his voice steady but low, "a man learns to carry only what he can keep alive." And the truth of that settled between them without resistance. She stepped closer then, not crossing the gate, but closing the space just enough that her presence felt less like distance and more like connection, and her gaze held his in a way that did not challenge, did not demand, but asked him to see beyond the surface of what stood before him. "Then do not carry them alone," she replied, and for the first time, Elias understood that this was not about giving him more than he could handle. It was about changing what he thought he had to handle by himself. The riders behind her had finished their quiet movement now, the line complete, the offering clear, but none of them stepped forward, none of them spoke. They simply remained where they were, as if waiting not for permission, but for recognition. Elias shifted his weight slightly, the ground firm beneath his boots, and he looked again at the horses, then at the riders, then back at her, and something inside him, something that had been shaped by years of doing everything alone, began to loosen just enough to let a different thought take hold. "You are not leaving them," he said slowly, the realization forming as he spoke it, and she gave a small nod, not surprised, not confirming, just acknowledging that he had reached the point on his own. "They will stay," she said, her voice steady, "as long as they are needed." And Elias felt the weight of that settle, in a way that was both unfamiliar and undeniable, because it was not just the horses, not just the tools, not just the quiet presence of 200 riders. It was something larger, something that reached beyond a single morning or a single act. The wind moved again, carrying the faint sound of breath and leather, and something else, something that felt like a promise without words, and Elias Boone, standing there with the past still behind him, and something new taking shape in front of him, realized that what had come to his land that morning was not leaving empty, and neither was he going to remain the same man who had stood there when the first sound of hooves reached his ears. The realization did not come all at once. It settled in layers, quiet and steady, like dust after a long ride. And Elias stood there with his eyes moving slowly across the line of horses, then to the riders, then back to her, as if piecing together something that had been placed in front of him without explanation. The words she had spoken lingered, not loud, not pressing, just present, and he understood now that this was not about what he could take or refuse. It was about what had already been decided the moment he chose to give without asking what came next. He shifted his stance slightly, boots pressing deeper into the earth, grounding himself as the weight of it all settled into something he could finally hold without resisting. "You chose this before you got here," he said quietly, his voice carrying no accusation, only recognition, and she met his gaze without hesitation, the faintest nod confirming what he had already begun to see. "Not just me," she replied, her tone even, and for the first time, she turned slightly, not to point, not to command, but to acknowledge the presence behind her, the 200 riders who had come without noise, without force, without demand, and yet carried something stronger than all of those things combined. Elias followed that motion, his eyes moving along the line again. But this time he saw it differently, not as a gathering, not as a display, but as something shared, something chosen together. These men had not come because they were told to. They had come because they believed in what stood between him and her, something that had started with a single act and grown into something neither side had planned, but both now stood inside. The wind brushed past again, softer now, carrying the faint scent of leather and open land, and Elias felt it move through him without resistance. The tension that had been there when the first hoofbeats reached him now replaced by something steadier, something that did not need to defend itself. "And what happens when I say no?" he asked after a moment, not as a challenge, not as a refusal, but as a man testing the shape of what stood in front of him, making sure it would hold no matter which way he leaned. She did not answer right away, and that pause mattered more than any immediate reply could have, because it told him that this was not something forced, not something that would break if he stepped away. When she did speak, her voice was quiet, but it carried all the way to him without effort. "Then we leave," she said simply. "And nothing changes except what you already chose yesterday." And Elias felt that settle deep, deeper than anything else she had said, because it removed the weight of obligation and left only the weight of truth. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing as the last trace of resistance slipped away, not because he was being convinced, but because he no longer needed to be. His eyes drifted once more to the horses, then to the riders, then back to her, and he gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as surrender, but as acknowledgement that what stood in front of him was not asking for either. The chestnut horse shifted closer again, its presence steady, unchanged, and Elias rested his hand lightly against its neck once more, this time without hesitation, without distance, just contact, simple and real. The woman watched him for a moment longer, then gave a slight signal, barely visible, and the riders responded not with movement forward, but with a quiet release, the kind that comes when something has been understood without needing to be spoken aloud. No one crossed the fence, no one stepped onto his land, but the space between them no longer felt divided. It felt shared, held together by something that had no need for names or rules. Elias Boone stood there, the morning light stretching across the land, the sound of breath and leather and wind settling into a rhythm that felt almost familiar, and he realized that the choice in front of him was not about taking what was offered. It was about deciding whether he would keep standing alone when the world had already decided he did not have to. And in that quiet moment, with 200 riders waiting without pressure and one woman standing without demand, he understood that sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is not giving something away, but allowing something to be given back. The answer did not arrive in words. It arrived in the way Elias finally stepped forward, not past the gate, not into their line, but just enough to close the space between what he had been and what stood in front of him, his hand resting steady against the neck of the horse as if confirming something that no longer needed to be questioned. The morning had fully settled now, the sun climbing higher, casting long lines of light across the land, touching the riders, the horses, the worn wood of the fence, and the man who stood at the center of it without asking to be there. He looked once more at the woman, holding her gaze not as a stranger anymore, but as someone who had crossed a distance that could not be measured in miles. And he gave a single nod, small, quiet, but complete, the kind of nod a man gives when he understands something that cannot be taken back. She returned it just as simply, no smile, no flourish, just acknowledgement, and that was enough. Behind her, the riders began to shift, not all at once, not in any hurried way, but with the same discipline they had carried since they arrived, some turning their horses slightly, others stepping back into a wider line, creating space not to leave, but to remain without crowding what was now shared ground. Elias noticed it without turning fully, the way a man notices the world adjusting around a decision he has already made, and he let out a breath that felt different from the ones before, lighter, not because the weight had disappeared, but because it no longer pressed against him alone. He stepped back half a pace then, not retreating, not distancing, but making room, and his eyes moved once more across the horses standing beyond the fence, each one steady, each one waiting, not for him to claim them, but for him to recognize what they represented. He reached for the reins of the chestnut horse this time, not as a man taking something back, but as a man accepting what had returned in a different form. His grip firm but calm, and the horse responded with a quiet shift, as if it too understood that something had changed without needing to be spoken. The woman watched that moment closely, then turned slightly, giving another small signal, and this time a few riders guided their horses closer to the fence, not crossing, not pushing, just placing them within reach, one by one, until the line no longer felt distant, it felt present. Elias did not move quickly, did not try to gather or organize what stood before him. He simply stood there, holding the reins, feeling the weight of leather in his hand, the warmth of life at the other end of it. And he understood that this was not something to be rushed, not something to be counted. It was something to be lived into. The wind moved again, carrying the faint rhythm of breath and the quiet sound of shifting hooves. And it felt less like a warning now and more like a rhythm he had stepped into without realizing it. You do not stand alone here anymore, the woman said finally, her voice steady, not loud, but carrying further than it needed to. And Elias did not answer right away, because some things are not answered with words. Some things are answered with the way a man remains where he stands. He gave another small nod, slower this time, deeper, and his eyes moved once more across the land that had once felt too large for one man and now felt just large enough to hold what had come to it. The riders began to turn gradually, not leaving all at once, not disappearing in a rush, but spreading out, some staying near the edge of the land, others moving along the horizon, forming a presence that did not crowd, did not demand, but remained. Elias Boone stood there with the reins in his hand and the tools waiting by the gate and the quiet strength of something new settling into the ground beneath his boots, and he realized that nothing about this morning had been loud. Nothing had forced its way into his life, and yet everything had changed. Out here, on land that remembered every choice a man made, kindness did not echo with noise. It returned in silence, in presence, in the kind of weight that did not ask to be carried, but stayed anyway. And as Elias turned slightly toward the barn, toward the work that had not disappeared, he understood one simple thing that would follow him long after the riders were gone, that a man does not always see what his actions become, but sometimes, if he stands still long enough, the world shows him anyway.